Okay, so what this lecture, this very abbreviated lecture, is a very short conglomeration of a bunch of lectures that I gave this semester for a special topics course on dinosaurs. If I'm around in the spring, which hopefully I will not be, but I may be against my own will, then I will give this seminar, this special topics course. Again, it was 2 credits. So if you were in my class before, then you will know and you will recognize many of the pictures that you see up here, and you'll recognize the slides. And what I'm going to try to do in this talk is just give a very brief overview of what we know about dinosaurs, which I think all of us can agree are very cool animals, and what we don't talk about very often. And I will try to do that by going through a little bit of vertebrate evolution, talk about the geological time period that dinosaurs at, talk a little bit about the dinosaur ecology, and then end it with why don't we have massive dinosaurs like the sauropod walking around anymore, right? There has to be an explanation for that, and what do we actually know about how that actually came to an end. So dinosaurs, of course, this name actually means terrible lizard. The word saur, S-A-U-R, refers to lizard, and I think traditionally we consider dinosaurs to be reptiles by and large. I'm going to talk a little bit about why we may want to reconsider what we think of as a reptile. But this is a pretty good reconstruction and a very modern reconstruction of a sauropod. We have a lot of things that are done right here. The limbs are pushed up underneath the body. The original reproductions of sauropods had them sprawling out like a crocodile. But these legs are pushed up right underneath the body. We actually have some color along the body now, which we think would probably be the case. They have these really nice whip-like tails, and we know they didn't drag them because we don't see the tail drag marks with the footprints. And we have a really nice bit of detail and structure here. We've got all sorts of stuff, like we've got a really nice large belly, which was absolutely the case, and we've got skin folds and all sorts, and we even have this little tiny bit of skin which sits underneath the neck, and that may in fact have been the case. That may have been something that sauropods used. It's common in reptilian lineages to use skin or material around the head for display purposes. And this guy apparently is screaming. So when you think of lizards, you think of a very diverse group of animals. I don't think, or I should say reptiles, and I don't think any of you would disagree, but these are all classically reptiles. We think of things like turtles. We think of this, we call lizards being a large group of different animals. We think of crocodiles, right? And we think of tuatars. These are actually all distantly related groups. And so the word reptiles, we really need to be careful about how we actually go about applying that term. One of the things that we think of with reptiles that we certainly consider to be very reptilian, right, is scales. Scales seem to unite reptiles. We're very agreed upon that scales are very important for them being reptiles. They have dry skin. Don't let anyone fool you. If you touch a snake, it is dry. And they are what look like these sort of sprawling animals, right? And that's not really fair. These are chicken feet. Unfortunately, the owner is no longer with us. But you can absolutely see that there are scales on these feet, right? These are absolutely 100% the same stuff. They are scales 1-to-1, just like you would find on something like a crocodile. There's no question about that. So if you're going to use the word reptiles, you really need to be careful about how you apply it, because if you're not going to include birds within that, that's really an unfair grouping. So chickens have all sorts of characteristics that unite them within the reptilians. And so what can we go about talking about? Well, what we need to first talk a little bit about, and I would spend more time on this if I had, but we use cladograms. If you were in aquatics already, or actually you've all seen it now because you were in aquatics so far, you saw at least a very basic cladogram. And of course, all of the terrestrial vertebrates that you see today, including yourselves, belong to this group of fish called the lobe-finned fish. So I know that we often define fish as gill-bearing organisms. Sometimes they have scales. Often they live in water. But that's actually completely unfair. Fish, as a rule, if you really want to call fish fish, if you call a coelacanth a fish, then absolutely you are a fish. No question about it. You're a sarcopterygian, lobe-finned fish. You fall within the group. You don't get to say, I made it far enough up the tree, I'm not a fish anymore. That makes no sense. You're a lobe-finned fish. You get to say, I'm a lobe-finned fish with a lot of time added to me, but I'm not a lobe-finned fish. And so actually within the lobe-finned fish, the groups that made it onto land belong to 2 large groups. We have what are the early members that invaded, the amphibians and the amphibian lineages which have persisted. Again, they don't have scales. And then we have what are called amniotes, and that's all the other groups around today. All the other terrestrial vertebrates that aren't amphibians belong to one group of successful land vertebrates, and those are the amniotes. And what is an amniote? What is reptilia? Well, reptilia, maybe why we should define it is something like this. An amniote is an animal that has an amniotic egg. An amniotic egg, okay, there's a yolk sac. Lots of eggs have yolk. but there's also this really important thing called the amnion. And the amnion is what really allows eggs to get out of the water and spend time on land. So you really are a fish, right? It's not just that you have that these animals have eggs that are like a fish. They're actually recreating aquatic environments within their eggs, right? They have to, because their larvae, or I should say their embryo, developed in an aquatic environment because they're a fish. They bring that baggage with them when they come. And so the advent of this very specialized egg, where we have a yolk sac, now we have to have some sort of storage device for waste, right? Because we can no longer interact with our environment in the same way. And at the same time, we have to protect the embryo while also allowing oxygen to come in. So it's a very complicated thing, and the group that managed to do it are the amniotes, and they are the ones that really invaded our terrestrial environment and by and large have been the successful members on the surface of the Earth. And if you don't believe me that amniotes are groups including ourselves, then of course you would look at a platypus. And I don't think you can argue too much with me that platypus are mammals. They absolutely also have eggs, 1-to-1, no question about that, right? That's a platypus coming out of an egg. And guess what? It's an amniotic egg, so they belong to what we would think of maybe as something like a reptile. And if you think that humans are any different, well, you're very wrong. The difference with humans is not that they don't have the amniotic egg, so they don't have the amniotic egg shell. They've given up the shell so the embryo can attach directly to the mother. But all of the other structures are identical. It's no coincidence that an embryo of a human develops a yolk sac but never puts any yolk in it. It's no coincidence that all of you carry genes to produce yolk, but none of you express it, right? These are stupid facts that come with being a lizard thing that is living out of the water and wants to be a fish, right? So we bring all this baggage with us. So really, when you think about, well, dinosaurs are really different from us, they are very different from us, yes, but they are also very closely related to us. They belong within this amniotic group, and they belong at least somewhat closely related to our own lineage. So what is the difference then between our lineage and dinosaurs? Well, it turns out that early amniotes and early vertebrates had this skull called an anapsid skull, which is a solid skull. And if you took CVA, is anyone here taking comparative vertebrate anatomy? I'm going to warn you that you studied, for the anapsid skull, did you study the turtle? Okay, turtles aren't anapsids anymore, it turns out. They're actually modified diapsids. But they have a skull that looks something like an anapsid. So anapsid skulls look like this. They have two openings. This is the nares. This is where the nose comes out of. And then this is the eye, right? Okay, that makes very good sense. But then these other groups, the synapsids and diapsids, have these weird holes at the back of the skull. And those are actually used for muscle attachment. You're actually this group. You belong to the synapsids. You're a more primitive lineage. You have only one opening. It's the opening that allows the muscle of your jaw to pass through to attach to the back of your skull, right? There's just that one opening. So that back of the opening, what they call it, fenestra, has actually been moved down and to the side of your head. Turtles actually look like this, but it turns out they were diapsids, but they solidified their head to increase protection, probably around their brain, and because they're not terribly worried about speed, right, or about lots of different jaw musculature. So dinosaurs actually are not synapsids. This is us. These are not dinosaurs. They belong to this other group, the diapsids. They have two openings in their head. These arose later, and the two openings in the skull allow muscle attachments all over the place, right? They allow really complex muscle arrangements within the skull. So there are none of these guys left as far as the amniotes are concerned. So what does it look like from a cladogram point of view? Well, actually, the closest living dinosaurs belong to this group called the archosaurs, and the closest living relatives of dinosaurs that aren't dinosaurs actually are the crocodilomorphs, the crocodiles, right? And I think you can agree with me that this animal right here, the Rhesuchians, look a lot like crocodiles that walk upright. And that, again, is not coincidental. These are all animals that are related, but as you go up on these branches, they become more and more derived, right? They add a bunch of different features to them. Okay, so crocodiles are actually fairly closely related to dinosaurs, and certainly much more closely related to a dinosaur than, say, a reptile, and definitely, or not a reptile, a lizard, and definitely more closely related to a dinosaur than you or I are. But that doesn't mean that we're not related at some level. These other groups are sort of more uncommon. You may not know them very well. This group, I think you do know, the pterosaurs, it turns out, are very closely related to the dinosaurs. And then, unfortunately, we have this group of animals called the Dinosauromorphs, which are not a group. They're just a conglomeration of different lineages that we lump together. And actually, it turns out dinosaurs belong within this group, Dinosauromorpha. So dinosaurs are Dinosauromorphs, which I guess is a good thing. But you can see that this is in quotes, so it may eventually disappear out of the literature. In any case, dinosaurs fall over here, and they come in two different flavors. And this very classically is a dinosaur, right? I think by and large, this is actually the case. If you see a dinosaur, you actually don't need a key to identify it. Most people can just look at them and say, that's a dinosaur. Like, that's very clearly a dinosaur. And maybe this is one of the appeals to them, is that they are very distinctly different. And that is true, but that's probably because a lot of the organisms that they're related to, we don't have access to. They probably weren't on the surface of the Earth very long, so we don't have to worry about that. But within the dinosaur tree, there are two very large branches. So there's a branch here to the left, and there's a branch here to the right. And of course, within this branch to the right, the Dinosauria, you will find aves, right? Aves sits way down here. So when someone says that a bird is like a dinosaur, that's wrong. Actually, birds aren't like dinosaurs. Birds are a very derived version of a Microraptor. They're actually a dinosaur. They're not kind of similar. They're not pretty close. They're not got some things that dinosaurs had, but not all. No, they are a dinosaur. There's no question about that. The question is, what do they have that's not like some of the primitive members of the dinosaur tree, right? So dinosaurs, if you want to see one, all you have to do is go outside. You will see one. They are very abundant. They are still the most speciose group of terrestrial vertebrates, and they have done very well. And so the sort of the dogma that dinosaurs died at the end of the Cretaceous, and it was sadness for them, and the mammals rose to power, is by and large wrong. The dogma should be mammals took over large-bodied niches, and dinosaurs continued to flourish, and they became more speciose, but they managed that in small-bodied niches. So that is the sort of the story of the dinosaur, basically, at this point in time. In any case, the dinosaurs come in two flavors. Like I said, there are these groups called the Ornithischia and the Saurischia. Ornithischians, that actually means bird pelvis. It turns out, of course, that the bird pelvis dinosaurs, that is not the groups that gave rise to birds. And the Saurischia means lizard pelvis, and of course that is the group that did give rise to birds. This is an artifact of the way that their pelvises are shaped, and it turns out birds they convergently modify their pelvises, or I should say that this group convergently modifies its pelvis in a similar way that birds do. So unfortunately you have that, but this group, all this group over here is almost entirely herbivorous or entirely herbivorous as far as we can tell. There may be some omnivores down here at the very, very early beginnings of the lineage. And all of these lineages over here are more diverse. So over here we have sauropods are primarily herbivorous, although there are a few that are down at the bottom that are probably omnivorous or carnivorous. And then all of these guys are the big bad guys. These are the theropods. These are the big stompy guys that bite things. The fact is that most theropods are small, actually, that we only get a few very large animals, but those are the ones we like to talk about, right? The big ones that eat everybody, those are pretty cool. So this happens relatively early in the history of dinosaurs. We don't really have a good explanation yet for what the intermediate animal looked like, and we're not quite sure when it happened, because as soon as they appear in the fossil record, we have this group and we have this group, and they're already divergent from each other. So it must have happened either when dinosaurs were very, very low density and probably early in their history. So before I go any further, I just want to remind you about the geological timeline, because we kind of need to look at that first. And this is one that if you take the class with me, you will get very bored of seeing, because I show you this slide, and I show you this slide, and I show you this slide. And sometimes you can't see it, but on my screen I know I've copied the slide from a prior lecture, because I still have my notes from a prior lecture on it. So I keep showing you this slide. And that's for a reason. It's not to bore you. It's because this is really an important concept to understand. So where are we located? We're right here at this black line. And of course, all of human history is much shorter than that black line. You would sit happily right on top of that black line if we were talking about human history. All the rest of this, though, up here is what we call the Cenozoic, this sort of yellow and browns. That's the period after the last mass extinction event, when we have mammals sort of dominating the surface of the Earth. The other things here, the Mesozoic, include the Cretaceous, the Jurassic, right, Jurassic Park, and the Triassic. And this is what is classically called the reign of dinosaurs. It turns out, in fact, that dinosaurs are fairly rare in the Triassic, and they only are really abundant in the Jurassic and the Cretaceous. So there's a little bit of leeway there. There's absolutely no dinosaurs down here, and no dinosaurs further back. So this is going back in time. You can get all the way back here to the Hadean, and Hadean, of course, is named after hell. That's when Earth is basically a big molten rock, and you can't live there. So we don't need to deal with those either. So this is a period of time that we deal with primarily in the class. I don't deal with the rest of it because we have a whole other branch of science dedicated to the study of dinosaurs outside of the Mesozoic called ornithology, and that deals with everything else, right? And so very weirdly, we split them out. And that's sort of a characteristic of what's happened with naturalism, right? When we had early naturalists, we defined fish as things that swim in the ocean. And so we study things that swim in the ocean together, and we study birds as separate from reptiles because birds are feathery things that fly. And so, of course, they're not at all related to reptiles. You would never need to learn anything about reptiles and birds at the same time. They're not interchangeable in any way, and that's not the case. But unfortunately, we didn't set that up when we first started to develop science, so now we sort of have these boxes. And they do work for us to a degree, right? So we do use them anyway. There's a major mass extinction event that occurs here between what's called the Permian period and the Triassic period. That's really important to lay the groundwork for why dinosaurs appear on the surface of the Earth in the abundances they do. And then there's another really critical period at the end of the Triassic, beginning on the Jurassic, that gets dinosaurs from being low-level members of the community, present but not abundant, to being dominant members of the community. And then, of course, there's also another mass extinction event which wipes them out from large body niches and switches them into these small bodied, by and large. So the Permian period is a relatively great time. Things are doing really well. And then there's a huge climate event. And when I say huge, I mean climate change, but on the order of 2 or 3 or maybe even 4 times worse than it is today, at what we're predicting in our worst case scenarios. So to give you some idea about this, these are average surface temperatures at sort of the height of the Permian mass extinction event. Okay, so this is saying that the average temperatures fluctuate. The average temperature here, not at the equator, but away from the equator, is around 40 centigrade on the inside of the continent. That means half the time there are temperatures higher than that, right? 40 centigrade is pretty freaking hot, right? You're pretty far along your way to boiling water. You are halfway to 50 centigrade, and that is warm, very warm. There is not much that lives there, right? In fact, if you go look for fossils in these areas, this turns out to be parts of North America, and this is South America and Africa combined, right? You will not find any. There are no fossils. Nothing survives here. We wipe everything out between the meridians, right? They're gone. Everything is gone. What survives is everything that can run to the poles and live there. Everything else gets blasted out of the water. And unfortunately for us, that turns out to be a lot of primitive mammal-like animals. So you don't have to be a trained geologist. Unfortunately, this picture's a little washed out here, but you don't have to be a trained geologist to know something really big happens at the Permian event. This is a rock located in one place, so it's telling you a story. All of this rock is brown. There's an immediate and abrupt line, and then it changes to red. So you know that something massive happened in a very short time scale because it's so fast you can't even see it in the rocks, right? So we're dealing with tens of thousands to maybe a million years, something like that there are huge climate events occurring. This is what are called laminated beds, and this also occur at the Permian-Triassic boundary. This is right in between that, so this is right at the boundary event. Laminated beds are very rare in the fossil record after the Cambrian explosion and even a little bit before that. They only occur when you don't have worms. You cannot have worms to make laminated beds. So to get to this point, you would basically not have any living life here. So you can also count the number of beds here, and you can see how deep they are. And that gives you an idea about for how many millions of years you don't even have single worms traveling through sediment. This is death on a global scale, and it's like absolute. Like it just blasts groups out of the water. When we talk about mass extinction, we often say, well, we lose a lot of species, and species are always dying. That's too bad. At the Permian-Triassic event, we don't like to talk about species because there's too many going extinct. We usually back up to the family level and say there's a lot of families that aren't going to make it. And sometimes we come back further and even get out to orders and say a lot of orders are going out, right? We don't deal with it at this low species level. There's just too much going on. So this is a late Permian ocean. It's not similar to what you would see today, but you can clearly see that there's complexity there, right? This is the exact same location after the early Triassic begins. You go from this very diverse community with things like corals and sponges to just mollusks. And mollusks, by and large, manage to survive and make it through, at least to some degree. It becomes a mud flat with some clams in it, basically, is what it is. And this, like I said, this happens so rapidly in the fossil record that it looks instantaneous. So it's a very, very rapid event that occurs. This also happens at the same time. We go from these winding rivers to what are called braided channels. Why does that occur? What forms braided? Why do you get braided channels as opposed to these winding rivers that we see here? How do you do that? What's the difference between what you see here and what you see right here? What's causing the river to bend like this? What's all this? Sediment deposition, but what's causing that sediment deposition? Say it again? Not glaciers. It's really, really hot. What's all this green stuff? Plants. Plants are really important for the way that streams are formed. So actually, in the same time, if you look at river and stream deposits, you go from streams and rivers that form these normal braided channels like we see today, to many of them form this and they become flash flood systems. And they cease flowing consistently, and they only flow when there's a rain event, and probably only for days at a time. In fact, you get so much flash flooding events that you can see whole boulders moving because there's so much water coming down. So in fact, you can go and see old frozen flash floods in time, right, because they get buried in the rock sediments, and you can have boulders the size of cars moving downriver, right? There's nothing holding anything back because there's no plants on the surface of the Earth. They're restricted to very narrow bands up around the poles. So the Permian-Triassic extinction is enormously important in this way because it's changing the surface of the Earth. Prior to this, dinosaurs don't exist. By and large, our own lineage, synapsids, have done very well, and they have dominated the surface of the Earth. Things are looking good for synapsids. We are going to be reigning supreme for the next 300 million years, and then suddenly and abruptly, that is over. That is gone, and we don't have that anymore. And so what actually caused that? Well, actually what caused that was probably a lot of volcanic eruptions. All of this is lava from that event. So these are a lot of volcanoes. You can see it goes off there as well. And then I say, well, how much, right? The surface of the Earth is hard to understand. These are mountains of lava, right? These are actual mountains of lava that occurred at the Permian-Triassic extinction event. And these are dry. How much CO2 is being released? A lot of CO2 is being released. And then this to convince you further, right? This is a worn-down version of that. It would go up higher, right? This is all lava, and it was all outgassing. And unfortunately, it happened to be molten material from the bottoms of oceans, which just so happened to be large areas of carbon deposition, which meant that it was releasing more on average carbon than normal. And there was all sorts of other stuff going on because guess what? If you liberate lots of stuff from the bottom of the ocean, if you burn lots of organic matter suddenly, what happens when we burn lots of coal? What do we release in the atmosphere? CO2, what else? Sulfur, what else? Why do we have advisories on fish? Mercury, yep. So it turns out there were huge mercury spikes at this time as well. So even if you were an organism, if you're a high-level trophic organism, if you managed to survive, you would probably die from mercury poisoning at some point. There was just so much organic material being burned and then being rained back down that there was actual mercury deposition. So we have enormous consequences to this environment. And what that means is that we have it's not dead zones we think of in aquatic environments, okay. Actually, there's a terrestrial dead zone as well, and then organisms persist at the poles. And these would move up and down depending on how hot it was, because the volcanic events sort of occurred in waves. So these dead zones would move up and down, and every time they move up and down, they would wipe out more species. So our own lineage made it through, just barely. Not a lot of our members made it, but some managed to. And then the other group, the Diapsids, also made it through. So the other thing you can do is you can ask questions like this: are there any living groups that show the patterns of a PT? So a PT event would mean that they have no members right in the middle, right there. They would be all extinct. And the members in the southernmost portions and the northernmost portions will not have met with each other, will not have exchanged genes since about 250 million years ago, which is when this event occurred. It turns out that there is, in fact, a group like that. The lampreys are exactly this, and they're specialized for living in cool water or Arctic environments. Okay, well, that makes a lot of sense because there's probably not much else going on and anywhere in the center of the Earth. So these guys are sort of PT survivors. And the reason that they show this patterning of species is specifically because of that event. That is driving still the way that you see the species on the surface of the Earth. So you can look at it this way. I like this little Darwin here. So this is very true. This is an archosaur, which is a diapsid, and this is our little guy, a mammal-like synapsid. You can see he has whiskers already. And this is sort of the litter of death that surrounds them. And this is what happened. Synapsids lost control of the surface of the Earth, and diapsids evolved very rapidly after it, and they did very well. And they took over many of the niches that were originally owned by synapsids. And synapsids, by and large, what niches did they take over? Small-bodied terrestrial animals. And that's the ones that they maintained until the end of the Cretaceous, and then it flip-flops again. And so dinosaurs are part of this diapsid radiation that survived through this PT event. They don't dominate the surface of the Earth yet. There are lots of other diapsids around there, and you would recognize them, many of them, as things that look like crocodiles and that are kind of crocodilian but are probably somewhat dinosaur-like to your eye as well. They do things like they put most of their arm underneath their body. They usually run on 4 legs, but if they're running really fast, they can grab up their front legs up against their body and run on a few quick steps on their back legs. But dinosaurs, by and large, they become these bipedal animals, right? They become a lineage that specializes in bipedality. And these are the 2 lineages that I showed you before. Here are the Saurischians. This is a primitive hip that looks like a lizard hip. And this is an Ornithischian, and this looks like a bird hip. And the only difference really is that the pubic bone of the Ornithischians rotates backwards, and there's an actual reason for that. Here it is up close. Here's a really nice drawing of it. And the Ornithischians are a group of dinosaurs that began to specialize very early and do it very well on herbivory. So this is in the Triassic. They're beginning to evolve into these very good herbivorous animals. And you get all sorts of fun stuff involved with these guys, including you actually evolve a new bone in the skull. And that, again, is also for herbivory. That provides them another place, a good biting surface, and mobilizes these bones in the back to be used to build a very strong jaw that will be very useful later on for chewing. So you have, how many bones are in your jaw? How many? How many are in the primitive synapsid jaw? How many bones should there be? Well, I told you that we added 1 here. So there would be 4, but how many are actually in your jaw? Just 1. Where are the other bones? Their ears. Yes. So your other bones, all these 3 bones right here, those are your ear bones. Dinosaurs do not hear like you hear. They do not hear nearly as well as you do. Mammal hearing is phenomenal. The best. The best. Mammal hearing is really great. And why do you think that might be? They are active at night. Yeah, and why are they active at night, by and large? Yes, mammals are small, and they're active at night because dinosaurs are walking around eating them during the day. And so, by and large, mammals are probably not spending a lot of time on the surface. Why is it that humans are colorblind regularly? Why is colorblindness so common in humans? Very, very common. Do many mammals have color eyesight? No. And yet birds, how many colors do birds see? 4. How many do you see? 3. How many most mammals see? 1. They're grayscale. What kind of organisms need grayscale eyes? Organisms active at night or during the day? Night. Yeah, unfortunately your eye has evolved from a nighttime nocturnal animal, and so you bear the consequences of that. You do not have great daylight vision. You have good daylight vision, but that's only been picked up very recently. Purples and blues are not common to mammals. Very few mammals can detect purples and blues, and why would that be the case? What happens at night to purples and blues? They're black. Why would you need to see that? That's useless to you. Purples and blues are useless to most mammals. And so most eyes are not very helpful, but we as a primate lineage have had very good success with evolving more and more color adaptation and very, very good eyesight because of the fact that we deal a lot with plants and during the day. But guess what? These guys are keeping you out of the day most of the time, so you don't need those eyes. You don't need these very highly developed eyes, and so mammals by and large give away those eyes and probably re-evolve much more complex eyes very, very late. So we're modified because of these animals. Okay, so the other thing that these guys do is they also make a very flat chewing surface here. It's very, very in line with the actual chewing muscles, and that's really important for a number of reasons, and you'll see why in just a bit. And if you didn't believe me, here's the skull of that animal as well. These guys also have very distinct what are called triangular crowns. So if you look at the surface of your teeth, they sort of form like rectangles or squares. These guys actually form triangles on the surface of it. One of the things that mammals do really well, really phenomenally, is this process called occlusion, right? And occlusion is the manner of which these teeth come together and actually meet, and they meet perfectly. You can't miss a little tiny grain of sand in your mouth when you bring your teeth together. You can actually feel it between your teeth. And that's because your teeth sit so well together that even something as small as a grain of sand gets in the way of that. And that works really well when you want to chew. In fact, if you want to be a chewing animal, you definitely want occlusion, because if you don't occlude, then when you try to move your jaw, what ends up happening is plant material just passes between it and doesn't get ground up, right? And if it doesn't get ground up, where do you have to do the work of grinding it? down in your stomach. You have to pay for that by having a larger stomach and spending a lot of time in your stomach working and working and working and working the plant material. Or you can be a really inefficient herbivore. That's another option, and some groups do that. Well, that's fine. It really does help to increase the efficiency of extracting materials, and it's really quite fun to do, right? Mammals are actually really good at this, but there's actually one other group that did very well with chewing as well. Here's a lizard. This animal, not a mammal. This animal does not chew. If you ever see a lizard bite something, it bites and tears and swallows and bites and tears and swallows and bites and tears and swallows. There's not a lot of chewing that goes on in that case. And lizards, of course, because they don't chew, don't need this other adaptation, which is cheeks. You have cheeks because you chew. There's no reason to keep a cheek. You just need one because you have to hold food up against the side of your mouth. And it's also really nice if you're a chipmunk because you can pack stuff in there, right? But cheeks help you hold food up against your mouth. Just so you know, do not look up the word human cheek on Google Images. You will have to use something more creative, and this is the least worst image I could find of it. But it's the best we're going to go with. And that's very obvious. There's very little tooth that's actually emerging from your mouth when you open it, right? And the rest of that is covered up by cheeks because all of that material is going to be masticated at the back of the mouth, and it needs to be up against the tooth to do that. So chewing is really rare because you have to have a number of these things. You've got to have occlusion. You've got to have a nice large jaw. You have to have a jaw that makes a nice flat line with your skull, and you have to be able to hold that food up against the side of your mouth. You can do this as well with gastroliths, which are stones in the stomach. Mammals, unfortunately, have a problem. How many sets of teeth do you get in your lifetime? 2. What's your first set of teeth called? Baby teeth. And in other mammals, what do we call them? They're called milk teeth, right? Well, that leads to a lot of issues because it means, so we won't stay here too long, but it means there are a lot of problems. One is you have to have your teeth in line to get the occlusion. It means that you have things like wisdom teeth, right? These are really a big pain. It also means things like this. Why is this jaw descended like this? Well, because these teeth are very badly trying to find an occlusional surface to meet. And so your jaw can modify itself to help that. And normally that works very well if you wear down your teeth. But if you don't have any teeth, then you get a really weird looking jaw because the system is not working correctly, right? So teeth, and this is also very common, this is tooth decay. You don't die from tooth decay these days. That's not how humans regularly die. But if you look even 200 years ago, death by tooth decay is actually very common. Tooth decay is actually a real problem. It's a really nice place for bacteria to live. They constantly enter into your bloodstream, and they can cause massive immune responses, right? Because you're getting a lot of bacteria into the body, and it's known to the immune system. So the immune system keeps responding to it, and it gets stronger and stronger and stronger and faster and faster and faster at doing that, and it becomes really aggressive. So teeth are really dangerous to have if you're not allowed to get rid of them because they come with all sorts of issues. Well, for the Ornithischian dinosaurs, they came up with a better solution, which is, well, then just lose them, right? And so they actually make their jaws into these giant things called what are dental batteries. And each one of these is a tooth, actually, and they fit up against each other. And as they wear out, they just fall out. They just fall out of the skull. And so these are all teeth, and they wear out through time, and more are built up. And so dinosaurs don't have to deal with those problems. Ornithischians don't worry about that. They just chew, and they don't have to deal with that issue. And so that's also, if you can think about that, that's going to be a real problem for plants as well, because one of the ways in which they interact with mammals is they help to wear down their teeth, right? And that causes mammals to die sometimes. Ornithischians also have this really cool thing called kinetic skulls, which means that their skull actually physically moves. Your skull does not, your lower jaw does. And their sides of their skull actually rotate out as their tooth comes up to give them a little more room. And as their jaw comes back, it rotates back with it to give them a little bit more. It gives them just a little tiny bit more bite every time they come up and down, more surface area to grind against. And they look very much like modern herbivores because the selective pressures are the same. There's a cropping front. There is this empty area in between, and then there's this huge grinding palate that's further behind, and a very large and strong muscle complex that supports all that. And that is all present here. Cropping front, empty middle, grinding pattern, huge muscles that are coming up into the skull to support all that. Okay, so the other thing that they do well is they evolve a new jaw, This is the primitive jaw. This is one of our early members. This is a synapsid. Here's the temporal opening in the back here. This is called Dimetrodon. It has 2 different types of teeth. And actually, it turns out if you cut these teeth open, you'll find that in the different Dimetrodon species, they seem to have specialized on different things, so the teeth are slightly different, so that's all sorts of fun. But in any case, their skull is very simple. It acts like a scissor. When it cuts down, it bites through that, or cuts through that material. But you know that when you cut a circular object, what happens to that object in the scissor? Where does it go? It goes out. Yeah, and so that's a real annoyance, right? Because if you're trying to eat a prey item and it's moving away from you, that's not really what you want it to do. So that's not ideal, because its forces actually come out to the front. These guys are different. Their jaws bite in a slightly different fashion. And so when they come down, it's more of a flat surface, and you don't get that forward thrust of the material moving back out, which is great because it remains up against your cheeks, and you can keep rotating that plant material through your cheek and grinding and grinding and grinding and grinding and grinding until you're ready, and then you can swallow it. So these guys evolve this very complex chewing structure, and they become very good at being herbivorous in that way. Okay, so that's the Ornithischians. Ornithischians are very cool in their own right, and all of the duck-billed dinosaurs you see, the ankylosaurs, the stegosaurs, those all belong within the Ornithischia. The other group that I want to talk about is the Saurischia, and Saurischia are, I think, the ones that we typically think of as the really awesome members, and I'm going to spend a little more time on these guys than the Ornithischians because of some of that, and also because they're a little more diverse to some degree. So the Saurischians, again, are the lizard-shaped pelvises. Oh, I'll mention this too. This Ornithischian pelvis, the reason this pubic bone moves backwards is because it opens up more space within the gastrointestinal cavity, and you can build out a larger intestine. So if you're an herbivore, you're all sorts of Ornithischian. So Ornithischians are some of the most efficient herbivores that have ever evolved on the surface of the earth, and they did their job really well for a long period of time. Saurischians, of course, range from the largest land animal to ever live to the smallest, and of course that means that these are the smallest land mammals or land animals to live, and the largest ones. So sauropods at the largest end, you're not thinking of an elephant, right? Elephants are not actually that big relative to sauropods. You're thinking more in the lines of a herd of elephants per individual or more. These are big animals. They eat a lot. They do a lot of damage, and they make things different every time they appear, right? If you think about an animal that is this big, when it runs, if it's moving somewhere and it bumps into a 60-foot tree, it doesn't bump into a 60-foot tree. It knocks over 60-foot trees. That's a lot of mass. These are big, big animals. There are both carnivores and herbivores within this group, and actually the herbivores never get good at chewing like the other groups I just showed you right there. They actually never specialize on chewing. And they are monophyletic, so they're all related to one another. And we know that, even though these look really different from the other group I'm about to show you. So sauropods are really awesome, right? And this, we actually do know that they held their heads like this. Now, and different groups held their heads at different heights. So you can ask all sorts of very interesting questions about that as well. I think sauropods, you would agree with me, are definitely classic dinosaurs. They are huge, most of them, or almost all of them. They are absolutely the stupidest of animals. They are dumb. They are slow, almost certainly, and they are nothing like animals we have today. You don't have a good comparison to make with a living animal. We used to think, well, there may be something like elephants. They're not really something like elephants. That's very clear now. They're not like any organism that currently walks on the surface of the earth, and so they're actually somewhat hard to understand. They are a very, very highly derived group, which means that they have a lot of features that make them very, very unique, and that they are not some sort of primitive holdover from an earlier time. They're their own thing. And they certainly did this. They started very small and then became large. I'm going to show you the smallest sauropod we have on hand right now. This is the smallest sauropod we know of. I want you to note there's a couple things. One, these are tiny. These are chickens. You could definitely kick these things. The other thing is these look like predators. They are. This is an animal that's very closely related to theropod dinosaurs. Theropod dinosaurs are carnivores. But actually, by this point in time, which is in the Triassic period, these animals already have the skull structure that is characteristic of sauropods. So although this animal has none of the features you would associate with sauropods on the outside, this animal is very much part of the Sauropodomorpha, right? And they are very rapidly becoming their own thing. These members were probably, the very earliest ones are actually probably carnivorous or maybe omnivorous. and they become more and more herbivorous with time. Generally, they're not chewers or very weakly so, and then they have all these other cool things as well. Remember at the time, though, that they're feeding on, are they feeding on angiosperms? When do flowering plants evolve? At the earliest, the Cretaceous. The absolute earliest is the Cretaceous for angiosperms. How big are early angiosperms? They are tiny. They're nothing. They don't make up a significant portion of the population. What does an early flower look like? What does an early flower look like for an angiosperm? What does a broccoli flower look like? Just a little, yeah, it's the florets, right? So if you look at broccoli, if you hold it, those little tiny things are the flowers. Imagine if you scaled those down to their microscopic, those are early angiosperms. They don't look anything like what you think of. And it's even by the end of the Cretaceous, angiosperms are not really that common. They are there. There is some diversity, like you see today, but they are not dominant, and they are not the primary members of forests. So by and large, the members of forests that these guys are going to feed on are these things, gymnosperms, right? Big, 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 big pine trees. And other things too, right? The evergreen, cycads, pines, ginkgos, these are all members that they would chew on, and they are all probably targets of these guys. These guys are also very slow. Sauropods are very slow. You could walk next to them without a problem. Probably animals are moving at the order of 2 to 3 miles per hour regularly, if they move very much at all. And then later members actually end up being some of the slowest animals that we can measure, and they seem to sort of amble along at about 1 to 2 miles per hour. So you very easily keep up with them. I wouldn't do that. I don't know what they would think because they are not very smart. And during their evolution, they move from these bipeds, which is what most dinosaurs are, to real quadrupeds. So just to convince you that they're large, right? Here's a footprint. Here's a kid. Obviously, this is not a fresh footprint. You can't tell your kids that there are humans and dinosaurs walking together. This is a very old footprint with a kid in it. And here's a series of trackways, right, with a guy standing next to it. Rear, front, rear, front. They're very close together, so they're not moving very quickly, and they're moving along at a very slow pace. So that's the sauropods, and I think sauropods are some of the more interesting groups because we have so little understanding about them in some ways, and they really are very neat. But this is a group that people actually get excited about. This is the ones that even scientists think are cool, and these are the theropods. This looks like a T-Rex. Tell your friends it's got 2 fingers. I know it's a T-Rex. You're wrong. This is an Albertosaurus. It's related to T-Rex. It's much smaller than T-Rex, but the body plan for T-Rex is locked in much earlier. So T-Rex as a body plan, that 2-fingered hand is evolved much earlier than T-Rex, and the one that we classically know is T-Rex. Members of theropods are the carnivores. These are the members that eat the other members within these groups. They are probably closest in behavior and appearance to what we think of as the earliest dinosaurs, but we're not entirely sure about that. And the ones that I deal with in class are mostly these guys, the non-avians. So we break the theropods out now into what are called the non-avian theropods, which are all theropods that aren't birds. And then we say there's this other very interesting group, which are the avian theropods. So these guys are obligate bipeds. They're very, very fast in general, and they're certainly high-speed runners. Modern avian theropods, things like ostriches, regularly run at a steady pace of 40 miles per hour. That is not hard for them to do, and I would anticipate that it would have been no different, right? There's no reason to assume that ostriches are somehow better suddenly than every other dinosaur that ever lived on the surface of the earth, and they run faster. So these would be very fast members. This thing, largest group member, T-Rex, there's a lot of question about how fast they actually move. This is only very recently that we found out we actually have a trackway for them, and it depends on who you talk to. Here's a T-Rex trackway. This is actually a T-Rex footprint. A couple of things here to convince you that T-Rex is awesome. One, look at how deep this track is. How do you get deep trackways? You have to be really heavy. Yes. So to get deep tracks, you have to be really heavy. This animal's moving very, very slowly. It turns out it was moving at only a few miles per hour, and it's walking along a sandy beach. So it's probably walking along a beach, either looking for carrion or moving between locations, or maybe even hunting, or moving to another location to hunt. But these guys certainly moved around a bit. We'll wait till we can find more trackways for T-Rex. Most members have 3 toes on the ground, so very classically, you think of a 3-toed dinosaur. Some members do not. What group is this? Guess you can say it. I heard the right answer. These are the raptors, yes. So this is the first, second, and what is this toe? Which toe is that? That's the one with the big sickle claw. In Jurassic Park, what happens when they walk? What is that cool thing they do when they walk? Click, 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 click. Yeah, that's actually not the case because you can see right here. Do you see that little toe touching down? No. And of course, if an animal specializes in moving its toe off the ground, why is it doing that? Why would it bother to move the toe off the ground? What's the point of doing that? Keep it sharp. Yeah, it actually turns out that things like velociraptors and deinonychids evolved these incredibly articulating toes. Most of the time you think of a toe, you think of, well, it can move a little bit. These guys probably had toes that could move at about 270 degrees out of a 360-degree circle, which means that if they land on you, that toe is going to slice right through you and then come out the other side, which is really convenient if they're trying to eat you, right? Because they don't have to be very close. They just have to get close enough to do a whole slash, right? It goes all the way in and out and pulls whatever's in there. It's probably arteries and nerves, and that maybe will incapacitate you, and then they can hop off and wait for you to die. So that clicking noise, they did not do that clicking noise. I can say that absolutely, but they are still amazingly awesome. Just so you know, the velociraptors, how big is a velociraptor, actually? Yeah, and the body is like this. So it's like a big turkey. So it's not in Jurassic Park where you're getting hunted down. Like, those are not velociraptors. It turns out there actually are raptors that large. They're called Utahraptors, so that's still scary. And the other thing about velociraptors is, did they have feathers or not? Absolutely had feathers, and they actually probably had long feathers on their arms, very similar to the way that birds do, and they probably folded their arms up against their body very much like birds do, and they probably even use their hands very much like birds do, and so they are very bird-like. So when you look at a bird on the ground, like a turkey, and you see it moving, that is similar. It is not the same, but it is a similar fashion to the way a raptor in Jurassic Park should move. And if they're doing those sort of jumps with the legs in the air, that should reflect very much how we anticipate birds doing that, right? So it should look very much like a bird. So many members have 3 toes on the ground. Some have 2. Some modern groups actually have 2 as well. Those are the ostriches, it turns out. Here's one that's just awesome. So this is what we call sort of a find of a generation. So this is what is called the fighting dinosaurs. Fighting dinosaurs, here's a velociraptor. And here, does anyone know what this is? Protoceratops. Okay, how did they actually die? What is happening here?
It was a sandstorm.
Something covered them up for sure, so maybe a sandstorm. But what's actually going on right here? They are fighting, but describe it? Use the journal words that you know now. So where's this leg? Yep, and what's it aiming for then? Yep. It's probably aiming for things like the trachea or any of the arteries and veins that go up to your skull. What is going on here with this arm? Why did this animal die here? It didn't get crushed. The Protoceratops bit on its arm and held it. And so probably it sliced the Protoceratops's neck. That caused the Protoceratops to die. Protoceratops was biting onto the animal's arm. It couldn't escape, and they got buried together. And they got buried so quickly that none of these bones are lost, right? And you can actually see the animal here still crouching, right? And this one's still kicking, and the other leg tucked in away underneath there. So when I tell you that these animals are awesome, they are definitely awesome. And we don't get many like these, right? This really does give you an insight into the ecology. Do velociraptors eat Protoceratops? Apparently, yes, they do. They do hunt them down. Now, you can ask all sorts of questions about do they hunt in packs or not, and that we don't necessarily know. But that would be very interesting to look at as well. You can also find really cool things like bite marks. Okay, so what makes a U-shaped bite? Well, that's a jaw, right? So what is actually powering through this bone right here? That's a jaw powering through it. And what is this? Anyone know what this hip is from? This is actually a Triceratops hip. So this is not what we call lightly armored. This is a heavily armored hip. It's very robust because it provides an attachment point for a lot of muscles. And this is a Tyrannosaurus bite. And I will be very serious when I say that if you put a cinder block in a Tyrannosaurus's mouth and it was alive, it would crush that cinder block. This is just biting straight through that bone. So it didn't go in and try to eat some of the meat. It just bit right through the whole animal and took out what it needed. And then while it was also working around the other ways, it was hitting the animal so hard with its jaws that it was actually leaving tooth marks in the bone, right? So these animals are pretty active eating machines. Here is an animal that survived and had a tooth left inside of it that it healed over. And for Tyrannosaurus, we absolutely know they also ate bones at the same time because we have some of their feces. and it turns out, well, that what will be coprolites now, and it's just littered with bone chunks, right? They just eat the whole animal. They're just really not concerned about the bones. They're going to work on that in the back end. Okay, here's another stunning fossil. These are the really awesome ones. What is going on here? Oh, it is an Eoraptor. And what is it doing? It's guarding its eggs. And why are its arms out to the side? It is hunched over it, but why the arms out to the side? Like, why? What is that doing? It's covering it with feathers. Yes, these guys by now have evolved very long feathers, right? These evolved what you think of as sort of flight feathers. They don't initially evolve for flight. They evolve to be these huge arms. These arms are now covering these feathers. You can also, I also like to show people here too, is that the holding of the fingers is now, this is very similar to the way that bird fingers are modified in the bird hand. This is already starting to evolve, right? That these components have already been set within this group. This animal is clearly crouched over the nest. It's brooding these eggs. It may or may not be a female. It may be a male, actually. Males often do brood nests as well. And what happened here is that the top of the animal was eroded away before someone found it, and then they found this animal laying on top of these eggs. So this is what it would have looked like. So do dinosaurs protect their eggs? Yes, and probably in many cases like birds. They may in fact build nests, and then they sit on top of them and brood the eggs. So are dinosaurs warm-blooded? They are, maybe not all of them are warm-blooded in the way you think of them, but many of them are probably somewhat on that scale. And these later groups that evolve, probably very much so, are very active. Not to the level that birds are, but they're definitely regulating their body temperature. So we can ask all sorts of questions about, did they all do this? Do they use it? And the evolution of feathers. I also like to show you this too, because this is very, very interesting. When you get a lot of data, you can do cool things like draw growth curves. Here's a Tyrannosaurus growth curve. Here's that Albertosaurus down here, right? That's not really that impressive. It's only at a 1,200 kilograms, which isn't even a ton. I mean, it's not a big animal until it hits a ton. So, but if you get lots of specimens, all these little black boxes are Tyrannosaurus specimens we have, and now we can age them. You can see that we don't have any Tyrannosaurus currently that extends to 30 years old. So these are live fast, die young animals, and that they are doing a lot of their growth between 10 and 20 years of age, and they're probably sexually mature at about 17 years of age. So not that much different in the way that you think about something like a human in that sense, but they're probably very different in other ways. In any case, just to give you some idea, okay, so if you were at 15 years old, you're still less than a ton. In the matter of a couple of years, you're now in the order of 2 to 3 tons. Okay, so that's a lot of biomass. So if we're talking about food conversion ratios, you're eating a lot of dinosaurs. You're not eating some dinosaurs. You're not eating a couple of dinosaurs. You're hunting and eating dinosaurs all the time, and you're getting aggressive, and you have to defend territories, and a lot of you are dying because there's not that many out there to eat, right? These are big animals, and they have to fight for their food. And so a lot of these animals probably die. It turns out this animal up here, I think, is Sue. That's the oldest T-Rex that we have right now. She ended up dying from a parasite infection, and that's why we found her. Okay, so these are very cool animals, right? These are all very neat animals. Theropods, T-Rex, these are all awesome things. These evolved all during this Mesozoic period. We're very excited about them. Why are they not present today? Why are they not the dominant form of life in the large-bodied sizes today? Well, there's this, right? There's a kind of a big problem that ends at the end of the Cretaceous before the Cenozoic begins. There's a huge impact that occurs. This is what the Earth looked like right at that time period. What you can see actually is that there's an inland sea between California and the U.S. So at this point, you could have U.S. 1 over here, maybe the backup U.S., and then little bits of Mexico. And then here's Canada. We're just hanging out. It's mostly there, but you can see that we also keep Alaska to a degree. But a lot of it's actually underwater. Europe is scattered around as a bunch of islands, and North or South America and Africa are sort of divided as well at this point. And at this point, India has already taken off to go do its own thing, and Australia is just about to separate from the very southern continent there. So what is actually happening at this point is, again, I'll show you the same thing I showed you before, is that there's a very abrupt change in the rocks, even though they're in exactly the same place, and that means that something big just happened, and that we call, this here is called the KT boundary. It's called the, what's the more common, KPG boundary now is the other one that we use. I'm going to keep calling it the KT boundary. At the KT boundary, there's really awesome stuff there, including a very rare metal, extremely rare, the rarest of rare. There's iridium, lots of iridium, tons of iridium right at the boundary line, right in between those two. And iridium is not rare like you think gold is rare. If you're hunting for iridium, you would be jealous of people hunting for gold, because iridium is 1,000 times or more rarer on the surface of the earth than gold is. It is unbelievably rare. The only place, in fact, if you want to buy iridium right now, you can. And does anyone know where you can go get it? We can go down. Oh, I thought you were motioning with your hand. Don't ever motion in front of me. So the only place you can buy iridium in any reasonable quantity is at a car shop, and it's on spark plugs. Iridium is one of the most dense metals you can buy, and it makes wonderful spark plugs that go on and on and on and on and on. But they are also, as you would anticipate, extremely expensive, because they are coated with this metal down here, which you will notice on the rare elements of Earth is at the very bottom, right? Gold actually makes it in amongst the rarest, but this is down here, right? This is really rare. Why is it so rare? Why is it so rare? It's not that rare in the cosmos. Why is it so rare on the surface of the Earth? Where is the iridium that the Earth is made out of? Where did it all go? Comets come and bring it to us, so we know that it's in the cosmos, but where is our iridium now? Right. Our iridium, when the Earth was molten, sank away. So our iridium is gone. Actually, if you wanted to get it, all you need to do is burrow to the center of the Earth, and then you'll get plenty of iridium. You're not going to do that, so iridium is now rare on the surface of the Earth. So the elements on the surface of the Earth are generally much, much lighter. Right? These are the elements that come back up, and they're very light relative to these dense elements. So how common is iridium at this line? Really common. Ridiculously common, in fact. Background signal, right, is really down here, well below 0.5, and then all of a sudden at this one event, boom, you have a huge peak, and then it's gone. And that's it. So if iridium was common, and it's still present in the cosmos, and it's in Earth, either it came from the center of the Earth, so it had to have come deep from the center of the Earth, which seems unlikely, or it came out of the cosmos. So the explanation that would explain an iridium peak is impacts, or a large impact from something in space. The other thing you have at the boundary layer are these things. These are called shock quartz. Shock quartz is something you can find at nuclear test sites, and that's why we know a little bit more about it. It is when quartz crystal is heated up very, very rapidly and then cooled almost instantly. And what happens is it forms these fracture lines that don't align. It doesn't have time to align. The molecules physically don't have time to align, and so it forms these very unusual fraction patterns. So that's also present, so we know that something very weird went on, possibly nuclear test. And then the other thing that we know is that these glass spheres occur all over the surface of the Earth. And these glass spheres are also the same things that you get if you drop, say, an item into your milk. They form those little balls pop off and then rain back down into your milk. So you can try that tomorrow, but please don't mess up the kitchen too much. Maybe lower the milk down to half and then drop some stuff into it. But then that's the same sort of thing. So if you drop an item into a fluid, it pops up and it forms these little balls. Glass is very common because what is the surface of the Earth covered in that this glass is made out of? Silicon. Silicon is everywhere, so if you hit something and you melt it and then you spew it up into the atmosphere, it forms little balls of silicon. So again, you can find these at nuclear test sites. And so there's really strong evidence that something big hit the Earth right at that time event. So there was actually a crater found, it's a Chicxulub Crater, which is at the right size and the right time. There's good evidence to suggest that it happened right at that Cretaceous Cenozoic event, and that the layer thickness, as you would expect in an impact, changes. So close to the crater, there's lots of garbage. Further away from the crater, there's not very much garbage. And the Chicxulub Crater it turns out in the Yucatan Peninsula, which is south of us, so it's south of the U.S. in the Central American region. And it turns out that means that North America is coated, absolutely coated in sediments from the Caribbean, which seems hard to believe because it seems like the ocean, the Caribbean Ocean, shouldn't be moving hundreds of tons of sediment into places like Dakota, right? That seems unlikely. But if you have a huge event that slams into the surface of the Earth, guess what? The Caribbean Sea is moving out. So probably what did happen at the end of that event was that there was a huge impact from what we call a comet or an asteroid, and that if you were anywhere within 100 miles of the blast, you were dead on that spot. You were gone, right? You're just absolutely obliterated. You're vaporized. Some of you went into space, so you can go on forever floating around in the cosmos. But in any case, if you weren't within 100 meters of the blast, or 100 miles of the blast, there are some other issues for you. One is, of course, that because it landed in an ocean, a huge tsunami occurs. And this is not a tsunami like Japan had a bad tsunami. I'm not disagreeing with that. I'm talking about a tsunami that would have pulled the ocean out for hundreds of miles, right? And then when it comes back, you're not going to be near the ocean. You're going to be under the ocean. You're not like kind of near an ocean environment. They tell you run to high ground. In this case, I would just say, it's all right. You're never going to make it. If you get in a car, you'll never get away. It doesn't matter if it's a straight shot from here to the furthest inland point you can find. You'll never get out of the way. It's coming back so fast. So there's a huge tsunami. At the same time, tons and tons of material gets thrown up into the air. It turns out that if you melt things and then throw them up in the air, they're really, really hot and they come down and burn things, right? So there's lots of burning glass falling all around you, so that's uncomfortable. And that also means at the same time that the surface of the Earth is heating up because there's a lot of energy in the surface of the Earth. And that means that plant material is drying out very rapidly. Like if I was standing in this room and looking outside, I would actually start to see the tree leaves shriveling up and then raining, sort of hot molten glass would start to rain through that tree. Well, that's a really nice way to start forest fires. And actually we have really good evidence that there was a massive global forest fire at this time, that basically all of the world's forests burned. They just got scorched, and they burned off. So there's large global forest fires. At the same time, of course, if you slam into a surface of the Earth, you kick up lots of dust, and when you do that, you make huge clouds of sediment and sand and soil and all sorts of stuff that flies out and now starts to obstruct your vision up. So it would have been sort of it would have been a good example of what you would say when people in movies say, it's like hell on earth. That is what was going to happen. It was going to be hell on earth. It's literally on fire, and when you look up, it's sort of a black sky with molten glass raining out of it and lightning, and it's hot to the degree of you would die if you were standing outside. So it's not a comfortable place to be. And the size of the impact suggests that the item that ran into us, does anyone know how big it was? On what a good size figure would be? Yep, so the size on average is something, probably if Mount Everest had been traveling into the Earth, and it wasn't traveling at like 100 miles an hour, it's traveling at tens of thousands of miles an hour, right? So that's pretty fast. So if you imagine how much energy it would take to move Mount Everest, imagine doing it, but then making it move 10,000 miles an hour, right? That's a lot of energy, and so when this thing hits you, it's going to be bad. The crater is pretty deep. Yeah, but it's hard to tell because right now it's buried. So we're actually going to bore through it this year. And it turns out actually that the crater, it sank down, and then it actually pushed down the Earth so much that it acted like a spring and threw it back up into the air. So it actually compressed the Earth so much that it bounced back up. So you're not going to get the real depth. So after all this event, so after that initial really hot spell, everything burns up, people are dying. It's not people, dinosaurs are dying. Then it gets cold because there's this huge cloud that covers the sun. There's not a lot of photosynthesis going on. Unfortunately, we're pretty confident now that in North America it happened at the end of June, beginning of July, so right about now. And that means if you look outside, that would be bad for trees, right? That would be really bad. They wouldn't be angiosperms, but everything's tanking along, just churning along. There's lots of productivity going on. And then it catches on fire and burns to the ground. So if you're a plant or an animal that manages to survive, it's going to be a bad year for you. This is one of those feast or famine years. This is a famine year. Plants on the surface of the Earth largely die. Not all of them do. Of course, herbivores are going to die almost immediately after that. Predators and scavengers probably make do for a little while, and then they also perish. Ocean ecosystems collapse, so they are very dependent on what's in the lake that a lot of the organisms are dependent on. What are the little things that the zooplankton eat? The phytoplankton. Ocean systems, again, limnology, oceanography, very similar in some ways. Ocean systems are also very dependent on phytoplankton. There is no phytoplankton. The ocean collapses. A lot of phytoplankton actually go extinct because their populations can't appear on the surface. They simply can't produce organisms at a time where there isn't a cloud covering them, right? There's so little sunlight penetrating down that in many years of growth, there's never a year where there's enough for an organism to survive. So a lot of phytoplankton actually go extinct right now, and that persists for about 1.5 million years. And there's this thing called the Strangelove Ocean. The ocean acts actually very much like it did when bacteria were dominant on the surface of the Earth. You lose a lot of the large organisms, and it's basically a bacterial soup for a while. In many places, it's sort of churning along happily. So the surface of the Earth for a little while remains mostly devoid of large plant life, but the ferns always do well after these mass extinction events, rapidly repopulate, and we have huge fern spikes appearing right after this event, and they do well and cover the surface of the Earth again. So it starts to recover. So what actually managed to make it through? Freshwater organisms actually do really well. This should say greater. About 70% of freshwater organisms survive, and freshwater organisms depend primarily on what component? What are they dependent on? Alloxinous or autochthonous sources? What are they often dependent on? Alloxinous, right? And so if you don't have to worry about phytoplankton, well, that's a pretty good deal. You might make it through. So a lot of freshwater organisms seem to do well. Terrestrial organisms do not do well. Less than 30% of those species actually make it through. Actually, but multiple bird lineages do. So birds seem to have hit on a solution, and they got it a couple times right. Ectotherms did better than endotherms, as you would anticipate, because you have lower energy requirements, and this is good for us. Very small animals do better than large. And what are our little synapsid friends that are now mammals, actually? They're little guys. They're like rats, right? They're just rats. They're not rats yet, because rats actually are really highly evolved organisms, but they look like a rat and they act like a rat, right? And so your ancestor, if you had been there, you would have said, wow, look at all these like little rat cat things that are running around. But that's very closely related to you, and that's what's going to make it through. So what's going to end up happening is going to look something like this, right? You're going to have marsupials and little rat cat things, and they're going to be living high off the hog because there's no large organisms to eat them, and the plants are going to recover very slowly, and some of them are going to go extinct, but some aren't, and those systems are going to recover, and there's going to be nothing in them, and mammals are going to explode, and this is where mammal diversity blows up, right? This is where we go from being, okay, well, there are mammals here, I'm not really concerned about them, they don't function that, they're not a huge component of the environment, to being the dominant members of these ecosystems. And so that is the end of the age of dinosaurs as we think of them, and the transition to the age of mammals.